the station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Welcome to Hour of History Cities podcast. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and I'm back for another week of talking about Havana and talking about the importance of cities in history. Now, last week, I left you with a Havana that was building its own wall. It had a clear separation between what was inside the wall and what was outside the wall. There was the building of this pontifical university that was also ordered by the King of Spain inside the old city of Havana. So there was a growth of sort of a Spanish intellectual class as well as the beginning of growth of farms outside of the harbor. Now, this week, we have to move forward in time, and we have to move forward to a special event that sort of changes the economic history of Havana and leads to our two items today. The two items I'm choosing for today are tobacco and sugar. Now, if you've studied the Caribbean, if you've studied anthropology of Caribbean states, or if you just are interested in the economics of food, this will be highly interesting to you, and you'll notice some echoes from the work of Fernando Ortiz. But before we get to tobacco and sugar, we have to talk about how Havana became an even more important harbor in the Caribbean and an even more important port in the world. And that started in 1762 in March when the British decide to siege Havana. They lay siege to the city of Havana and they attempt to take the Spanish naval base in the Caribbean. And Havana was exceptionally difficult to take because of a couple things I've mentioned before. Number one, it's that great natural harbor. So the Spanish can park their 100-boat armada, as many ships as they want. They can safely park in this gigantic harbor that Havana has. That's one huge benefit. Another is that Havana is hit by hurricanes frequently. And while that puts a little damper on building up Havana into a great colonial city, what it does do is make it very difficult to invade. You have to invade Havana at only certain periods of time. And then third, with forts like La Fuerza, the Spanish have built up Havana to be a very difficult harbor to penetrate. Yet, in the middle 1700s, the British have built up their navy, and they're in the midst of the 7 Years' War, and they decide to attack some important Spanish ports, one of which is, you guessed it, Havana. So the British attempt to start this siege from March because they know they have to get their work done before August when the hurricanes start. And if their ships are still outside of the harbor, by the time hurricanes begin, they're going to lose a lot of soldiers. There's a couple other things that you have to take into consideration when you're laying siege in the 1700s, one of which is yellow fever. If the Spanish can hang on long enough, there's a good chance all the invading British are just going to die from disease. And that certainly happens. So the Spanish prepare for this war. They know there's war going on. The British are building up their navy, trying to lay siege to this port. And what happens is the British send a bunch of ships. They're going to take Havana. They try to block the Spanish from leaving, and they try to avoid yellow fever. About half of the British soldiers die before the British are able to actually storm and start to take El Morro, which is one of the forts of Havana, in mid-June. Now, long story short, the British take Havana, and the British conquer this city despite the yellow fever. They avoid any hurricanes, and they make the Spanish Empire surrender. They surrender in August, and this is only one part of the British successes. This is really where the British assert their dominance as a naval empire in the world. They also take the other important Spanish East Indies city of Manila. So Manila in the East Indies and Havana in the West Indies are taken from the Spanish, and the British are really asserting their naval dominance. Now, one of the things the British do when they get Havana to surrender is they start to reform it. They start to reform it economically. One of the things the British do is they liberalize trade. They start bringing in more slaves. They start bringing in more merchants. They start bringing in more corporations. And they start trading with their own colonies back in the United States. One of the things they want to trade, one of the things that is fantastic in Cuba, fantastic in Havana, and going to be fantastic in the United States is the cigar. So that fine Havana tobacco is rolled into cigars, and it's sent to the United States. And this begins a big tobacco growth in the United States. One of the invading generals for the British is Lord Albemarle, the name you might recognize in association with cigarettes in the Carolinas. So what happens is this whole cigar industry begins part of that triangle trade that's made so famous. Slaves are coming into Havana from Africa, from different merchants now, not only the Spanish, and rather than sending cigars only back to Spain and back to the main colonies of the Spanish Empire, it's now open for trade and sending to the United States. And this begins to make the tobacco industry grow and Havana grow in importance throughout. Now, while the British holding Havana is a huge blow to the Spanish Empire, it was nothing permanent. The British are not so interested in keeping Cuba as part of the empire. They have other concerns that are brewing in the Americas around the 1760s, as you well may know. So in 1763, the Treaty of Paris, the war is ended, and part of the agreement of the war is that Spanish Florida goes to the British and Cuba is returned to the Spanish. So the Spanish Empire goes back to Havana. They're ready to restart this city that was so important to them in the Caribbean, and they notice that the economy is much better. In 1 year, it seems the British have done more for the Havana economy than the Spanish Empire had done in 50 or 100 years by opening up trade and by creating new networks for these goods to flow. So as a result of that growth in trade, thus emerges two great industries. Sure, they existed before, but now they are just going to explode. And Havana is going to become not only an important harbor and an important trading location, but it's also going to become an important producer. So that's one of the big events that happens that really pushes this growth of tobacco and pushes this growth of sugar. Another thing that happens is the slave rebellions in nearby Saint-Domingue. So in what is now Haiti, there become slave revolutions. The slaves far outnumber the planters that are living on that French colony. And there's only 50,000 people in Havana when those sort of rebellions begin. So 30 years after the British take over, there's 50,000 people in Havana. Not a huge city, but certainly productively successful. The economy is going well in Havana. And then this sort of unrest happens in the slave plantation system in nearby Saint-Domingue. Well, what that does is leads to the Haitian Revolution, the abolishment of slavery in Haiti, and basically the world's biggest sugar colony falls. So all the sugar industry, most of the sugar industry shifts to the nearby island of Cuba, where slavery is still legal and slavery is still big, and sugar production goes up. So we see the enormous rise in tobacco production in the 1760s, and then we see a rise in the sugar production shortly after the Haitian Revolution. So just to chart the growth in population a little bit, in 1790, 50,000 people in Havana, 1820, 95,000 people, and by 1840, there's 190,000 people in Havana. So the growth just continues at what, for the time, is a pretty outstanding rate. Now, to talk about these two items a little more, tobacco and sugar, they've been used as symbols of Havana and symbols of Cuba, famously by Fernando Ortiz Fernandez. He was a Cuban anthropologist who studied mostly Afro-Cuban culture. And what he was talking about when he looked at these two different parts of Havana, tobacco and sugar, he gave them positions. Like the tobacco was the darkness, the sugar was the light. Tobacco was the bitter taste, sugar was the sweet taste. Tobacco was something that was done after the meal. Sugar was something that would enhance drinking tea, things like that. And he also introduces this other concept of transculturation, which is going to be central for our discussion going forward. So what Ortiz is attempting to do, and what he does quite successfully, is he takes these two products, tobacco and sugar, and he uses them as a gateway into the Cuban experience. So Ortiz argues that this Cuban history, and for our purposes we can say Havana history, is firmly embedded in this process of transculturation. And what transculturation is when cultures are interacting with each other and they're mutating and they're introducing different things to each other. So it's rather than just straightforward cultural exchange, like this was taken from this culture and added to this culture. He's describing that there's like a constant evolution that's happening between complex interactions between cultures. And some of the places where we see these interactions, these transculturations, are noticeable, especially on tobacco farms, tobacco plantations, and sugar farms and sugar factories. And the reason for that is because of this plantation system where you have these Spanish plantation leaders commanding large amounts of slaves to do this backbreaking work. Now, the sugar and tobacco are different. They can't both be cultivated all year, so it changed the way in which slaves were used for each of them. But more importantly than that, and more importantly to the transculturation process, the slaves that were brought to the island changed. So whereas the Spanish were using enslaved natives and slaves from the Portuguese slave trade at the beginning, the first couple centuries of Havana history, when the British come, they start buying slaves from the British. Now, after about 50 years after the British take over Havana, the British outlaw slave trade. So in 1807, slave trade is outlawed by the British. So the Spanish have to start looking at other options. So they can still potentially buy slaves from, say, the Portuguese or from Brazil, even from the American South, but there's no chance for them to buy from the British coming from Africa. And so A, they either invest in keeping the slaves alive to work on the plantation, or B, they start looking to different labor sources. And one of them is China. China and the coolie trade really picks up after the slave trade is banned, and you have another culture that's coming into this new Havana place, this new Havana where there's a new sort of artistic, linguistic, psychological, all kinds of new permutations of life are happening. And that's exactly what makes cities so interesting to study. So through these two products, through tobacco, the growth of tobacco after the siege of Havana, and the fine products that are created like the Cuban cigar, and sugar, and through the growth of the sugar industry with the consumption of coffee and tea in Europe, Havana becomes a much bigger, much more dynamic, much more economically important port, and one that the world has to pay attention to. So with that, I'll leave you for this week, and we'll join again next week on Hour of History Cities. Thank you for listening.